What are adaptogens and why should I take them? Well, today I'm excited to give you some really interesting and what I think can be life-changing information about perhaps my most favorite product, adaptogens. If you've read the newspaper, if you follow the trends, slowly over the last 5 to 10 years, this has become a more common or mainstream term. Yet if you look on the internet, it's still not that easy to find information about what adaptogens are and why you may want to take them and what the potential benefits are. So today we're going to talk about that. To me, adaptogens can be described by the name themselves. In science, oftentimes we use words that aren't as descriptive or as clear as they could be, but in the case of adaptogens, the name basically says it all. They help you adapt. They're called stress-induced or inhibiting stress-induced negative aspects. So what I mean by that is when you get stressed, your immune system and your neuroendocrine system changes. In this case, it's the HPA axis, the hypothalamus-pituitary-adrenal gland axis, which the end goal of that is cortisol. I know that's a mouthful, to stay with me here. The ultimate idea is when you get stressed, your body uses HPA axis to increase cortisol. Cortisol basically increases inflammation and gives you very short-term benefits, and in the long term can become harmful. In the long term, which is where most of us are, these negative side effects are what cause our problems in terms of fatigue, getting sick, lack of energy, difficulty focusing, and so forth. So basically what these adaptogens do is they help our bodies adapt to stress. It's very simple, also complex at the same time. Some of the ways that they can do that is having what's considered a neuroprotective effect, which means they've been shown to exhibit antioxidant properties on the nerves themselves. So over chronic times of stress, the nerves actually can become inflamed because they're overworked. Think about an electrical cable that's left on for too long, it overheats and becomes hot. Your nerves are somewhat similar. So the adaptogen itself can actually go in and basically act as an anti-inflammatory, antioxidant on the nerves and basically boost their health and allow them to work more freely. Another example is with the anti-fatigue. Like we said, if your cortisol levels are too high for too long, it begins to inhibit your body. In fact, they've shown it can inhibit things like ATP synthase. So that is the mechanism that your body actually uses to make energy, or ATP. And what they've shown through multiple pathways is that when cortisol levels are too high, the body actually can't make as much ATP, which is thought to be part of the reason why you feel fatigue, as well as you have other health problems, because ATP is basically the energy unit of your body. You need energy to do everything, especially when you're not feeling well, you need energy to heal. So if you don't have enough energy, you don't heal as well. So the idea is that adaptogens are going to basically help mitigate the effect that cortisol has on ATP production, basically boosting it in this case. Another example is working on the immune system and also the nervous system for anxiolytic. Again, we were talking about earlier about if you have too much inflammation, that can cause your nerves to become agitated or irritated. So this actually works, again, like we said, as an antioxidant and anti-inflammatory, and it lowers that level. There's also been evidence to show that adaptogens can mimic what are called catecholamines, in this case, dopamine and adrenaline-like molecules, which basically are the actual working components of your nervous system. So the idea is that by basically increasing those levels through adaptogens mimicking or regulating the production, we can basically increase the level of those neurotransmitters. Now, if you're familiar with SSRIs, serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors, those are also increasing the serotonin levels. So there's a lot of evidence to show that low serotonin or low catecholamines can be a cause for anxiety or depression. So it makes sense here, again, if we're taking a supplement, an adaptogen in this case, that helps our body increase or mimics these catecholamines to feel better. Another example of a catecholamine being used for depression is the drug Wellbutrin, which basically works on the dopamine side of things. So we have multiple examples of how this kind of mimics, in a more natural sense, pharmacology. And again, just stimulates the nervous system, whether it's from the inflammation component, the neurotransmitter component, or also regulating the proteins or enzymes that themselves make the dopamine and serotonin in these cases, bringing them to healthier levels. So those are some basic examples of how the adaptogens can work. Again, the focus is on the HPA axis. Some of the other issues that can happen when we have chronic cortisol levels being too high is what are called heat shock proteins not working as well. So again, heat shock proteins are something we didn't really hear about too much 5 or 10 years ago on a more public discourse, but now we're seeing them more and more. A great example would be saunas and cold plunge. So in both cases, you're actually activating your heat shock proteins. Basically, the idea is that your proteins are strings, almost like a string. And then when they are folded, they basically tie together in a knot, and that knot gives them the structure. and that structure is what allows them to have their activity. The problem is with wear and tear, life, free radicals, things like that, the structure changes and the structure dictates the function. So when we have impaired structure, we have impaired function. So what these heat shock proteins do is they actually go in and they refold those proteins into the proper structure, which basically makes them work again. Or if the protein's degraded, it actually gets rid of it and recycles it and makes a new one, which in some cases is actually even better. It helps you basically recycle, turn over, and get new proteins, versus without this system, you have basically proteins that don't work due to incorrect structures. So again, heat shock proteins are kind of a new thing right now. Some examples would be saunas and cold plunges. A lot of these herbs actually work on the heat shock protein system, and it's something that we're going to be looking for more in the future as a main channel for wellness, just to kind of like touch on that real quick. Another example there are stress protein pathways. We talked about NF-kappa B with turmeric in a prior video. That would be another example. The adaptogens actually can go in and basically reduce the activation of those pathways, so lowering the immune system's overreaction, which could be a good thing. Typically, those can be done through things like transcription factors. So again, you have a protein that goes into the DNA and changes which part of the DNA is actually being used. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. In the case of the immune system being overly active, it's a bad thing. So these adaptogens can either go in and block the transcription factors, they can increase the good transcription factors, or they can also modulate or have an effect on upstream from the transcription factors, basically preventing the cortisol or the stress from turning them on or off. Let's give some additional examples. We already talked about cortisol and how it basically reduces that. An example we can use is what's called an antagonist in pharmacology. So the idea is that the adaptogen binds where cortisol would bind and prevents the other molecules of cortisol from binding. A really common example of this would be Narcan. So if you have been using heroin, for example, and it's basically overdosing you and you're no longer able to breathe, that's because all your receptors are full with those molecules. What you can do is take Narcan, which will basically displace the heroin from that receptor, and then Narcan goes into it and binds it but doesn't turn it on. So it basically prevents substance A, heroin in this case, from binding to the receptor, and two, it turns down the response by deactivating the receptor, but also prevents something else from binding into it. So in the case of cortisol, it has the ability to do that with an adaptogen standpoint, where it basically makes the cortisol not effective anymore, similar to how Narcan works with overdose recovery. It also has been shown to healthily, in a more optimal way, affect nitric oxide, because nitric oxide production can also play a role in stress and also ATP production like we talked about earlier. So those are some of the 4 or 5 more common mechanisms of how the adaptogens work. Again, because of these features in your body, these benefits of adaptogens, when we study them either in cell lines or in small animals, like nematodes, for example, some of the findings that have been shown are increased attention, endurance with fatigue. So this is a real big one where when you get really tired, your ability to think clearly is even more diminished. So not only are you tired, but when a new stressor comes, you're even less able to deal with it. The adaptogens have been really documented and studied as that. An example is rhodiola. It was used by militaries in the 60s and 70s as a potential drug to help boost our soldiers' energy output and production and stress. So again, talking about a fight or flight type situation, it wears on your body over time and causes problems. It's very hard to pay attention for a prolonged period of time. The fatigue begins to occur. A lot of that is from your immune system and also from your neurotransmitter system, your neuroendocrine system. The adaptogens basically kind of help balance that out and allow you to pay attention and have a higher attention span and better focus, especially when you're stressed out, which is common for a lot of people these days. We talked about that. And then that. So it's another example that we talk about adaptogens was called homeostasis or hormesis. So the idea is moving things into balance. So the classic example that I was taught with adaptogens would be licorice. So if you have someone with high blood pressure and you give them licorice, it will lower their blood pressure. If you have someone with low blood pressure and you give them licorice, it will actually raise their blood pressure. So a lot of people talk about how adaptogens aren't so much directional. They don't just go left to right or right to left. They move toward the middle, or called hormesis or balance again. So I think that was one of the really interesting concepts of adaptogens that brought me in the beginning, is that whether you're over here or over here, they do the same thing, which is to bring you into the middle. And whether you're in Eastern medicine, wellness, mental preparation for life, we all have in one way or another kind of understood the concept of balance as being a goal to get to. And so it's really interesting that adaptogens also have chemical mechanisms that allow them to do that. Continuing on, again, we want to talk about how they do mimic the catecholamines, which allows them to basically help boost the production. So again, if we're in a prolonged stress period, our body's ability to make dopamine, adrenaline, and serotonin are going to become impaired. You could only make something for so long before you have to take a break, replenish, and then go back to work. That's where a lot of those fatigue effects come from. And so because the adaptogens can either regulate those processes, they can prevent the cortisol from accelerating those processes, or in other cases, they can more directly mimic those actual molecules. For all those reasons, they can actually, again, help prolong your ability to perform under stressful situations, and again, reduce the impairment that stress over a long term will put onto the body, which is very interesting. Another example that was shown in a study was that the adaptogens actually have monoaminase oxidase inhibitor properties. MAO is the typical term that we use as pharmacology. So the drug class of tricyclic antidepressants, that's how they work. They actually work on that molecule. So that's one of the molecules that breaks down dopamine, adrenaline, and serotonin. So the idea is if you inhibit the breakdown, you can artificially raise the levels. So there's actually been evidence to show that the adaptogens, because of their ability to mimic things, in this case, catecholamines, they can actually have a similar effect on the MAO inhibitors and basically naturally help keep the levels of those catecholamines higher for a prolonged period of time, which again is very desirable. There are many pharmaceutical drugs that work very similarly. And like we said earlier with the SSRIs, they're also trying to prevent the breakdown of serotonin to increase the serotonin levels. The adaptogens are working very similarly, which is quite interesting. Again, an example of how they promote the hormesis or homeostasis, which is, again, keeping things in balance by making sure that they have enough resources. It prevents the gas tank from running empty, so to speak, because it keeps the fuel source going. Again, whether it's the ATP production, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, suppressing the negative aspects of the immune system, or in this case, actually boosting the nervous system, either directly as mimicking catecholamines or helping the proteins above and after the catecholamine production stay active, but in a more functional and prolonged way. So those are all really interesting things. Again, one thing that's important to mention in the philosophy of herbalism is the idea is that these plants have a lot of biology in common with humans. And so the reason why we think or we know that these herbs help is that the same challenges that we face, these plants face. And so they have evolved these processes to help themselves. When we ingest those proteins, it has a similar benefit. So the classic example is if you have a bug on your arm, you go like that, right? Well, a plant can't do that. If it's really bright outside and it's getting too hot, what do? We move into the shade. A plant can't do that. If the environment around the plant becomes less than hospitable or not ideal, the plant just can't get up and walk away and go somewhere else. So instead, the plants have to evolve these mechanisms to deal with it. And again, in all those situations, it's easy to understand how those would be causing stress for the plant. So it would make sense intuitively that the plants had to evolve a process to be able to help them deal with and cope with that stress. Because unlike humans, they can't get up and go home or go inside or turn the air conditioning on or drink more water, whatever it may be. So the idea, again, is that plants and humans have evolved similarly in similar environments. The plants don't have the same abilities that we do, so they've had to invent coping mechanisms, which typically are proteins, because when the proteins are expressed in the plants, they float around the plant, they bind somewhere, they do something. Well, when we eat those herbs, we're actually ingesting those proteins, and those proteins can have a similar effect on us. In fact, a lot of drugs today are proteins, so the idea of a drug and a protein being similar or the same is not a new concept. It's the way the world's going. Just to kind of give another example, what we're also seeing is that proteins, because they typically come from nature, they work better in our bodies. So unlike the old school small molecule drugs like SSRIs, which were synthetically made, they can only do one or two things typically. These proteins are much more multifactorial because they're, again, made in nature, and the nature has had time to evolve, and the system in which these proteins exist also co-evolves with them. So as the protein confers a benefit, the system in which the protein operates kind of adapts within itself to maximize the benefit that protein would give it, because each system obviously wants to do well, because when each system does well, the organism does better. Just to give some additional examples. Again, in closing here, we're really focusing that adaptogens are stress protective. They're going to help you deal with stress, both mentally, physically, emotionally, for your immune system and your neurotransmitters and beyond. They work on heat shock proteins. They help prevent immune cascades or immune pathways from being activated, which in the long term reduces the negative impacts of your immune system or your cortisol system being elevated for too long. They also work on transcription factors, so they have the ability to actually affect our DNA, whether it's turning off things that aren't good for us or turning on things that are good for us, so they can re-regulate the transcription on a genomic level with our DNA and basically say, hey, I'm stressed. This makes me feel better when I'm stressed. Let's make more of that. Or I'm stressed. I'm making a lot of this, which is making my stress worse or lowering my energy levels. Let's reduce the body's ability to do that, which effectively allows us to deal with the stress better. So it works both of those levels on transcription factors. We talked about the HPA Axis, which is really what regulates a lot of the cortisol production. Again, cortisol is more and more common a topic with people's health. There's a thing called adrenal fatigue. The A in HPA Axis is adrenal. So again, the idea being that when we make too much cortisol or we have too much cortisol for too long, it has negative effects. So these adaptogens, by being able to regulate HPA Axis or regulate cortisol, help mitigate the damage or the long-term downsides of that and put it into a more healthy balance. And again, we talked about hormesis, which is how it dampens the stress response. So again, it's very similar, where we don't need to respond as much to get the same outcome because our body is much more in tune now. It's functioning more optimally, and it doesn't need as much to go as far, which in the long run helps us, because if we use too much too rapidly, we run out of resources. And then once that endurance component comes into life, we basically experience that fatigue due to lack of resources. Again, the adaptogens help that on multiple levels. And again, we also talked about how adaptogens can regulate energy production, ATP production, by basically keeping the nitric oxide levels optimal, the genomic expression levels optimal, as well as the fact that cortisol in itself in the long term can reduce our body's ability to make ATP. So those are all really interesting. So that's about what we have here today. We think these are something that everyone should include in their protocol. Just to disclose here, if you are taking prescription antidepressants or other psych meds, you must talk to your doctor first about trying adaptogens. Generally, herbs are very safe. However, when you mix herbs and pharmaceuticals, there are some cases where we do want to have some more caution. Those ones typically tend to be psych meds, blood thinners, and pain medications. So if you're on any of those three, you definitely need to talk to your prescriber first before taking adaptogens. But basically, for anyone who's not on prescription medications, adaptogens should be very safe. There's substantial evidence to document that. And I highly recommend anyone who's interested in having more energy, and being able to handle stress better, who wants more balance in their life, to try these products. I'll definitely say anecdotally, in my own experience, I've been taking adaptogens for over 15 years. I currently take ashwagandha and rhodiola on a daily basis. I have for years, like I said, and I always have noticed a difference. I notice that I am calmer. My mind is more clear. I don't have all these thoughts that are jumbled around in my mind. My mind is very focused, but in a very calm way, like I said. I definitely know it helps me have more energy. My energy levels almost are always very high. And at the same time, I handle stress well. So the few times in my day that I do have to deal with stress, I notice that I have stress, I respond to it, and then it goes away. There's no lingering effect, and I don't feel this prolonged fatigue or fatigue-induced issues like we mentioned in the video earlier. So I personally think everyone should take them. My own experience, like I said, has been significant. Adaptogens changed my life. I had some moments early in my life where things were getting me down, and I found it quite difficult, to be honest. And adaptogens were probably the second or third biggest thing in that protocol that I used to get out of that. I personally think they're the future because they're safe, they work very well, and they work on a very broad spectrum in our body. Like I said, they do multiple things. At the same time, everyone has stress. Life is always going to bring stress, and it's our ability to stay calm and present and focused that helps us best combat stress, as well as having the energy to push through it and the energy to continue forward. So again, in my own experience, I don't know of anything else that I would recommend to somebody who's struggling with stress or life or really energy levels in general besides adaptogens. They offer so many benefits, and we're really excited to talk to you more about them today. If you'd like to learn more about adaptogens, you can send us a contact us information to get more information if you're interested. You can also put comments below if you have questions. We can respond to those. And if you want us to incorporate any of those topics into future videos, feel free to label that in the comments as well. Thank you. And again, I think adaptogens are something for everybody to consider. I personally think they're the future. And I definitely think in 10 to 15 years, we're going to see a much higher usage of them in the United States. It's going to become much more mainstream and something it's common practice, part of life. Because again, there is so much evidence to suggest that they really do make a difference. Thank you.